Rockin' Politics, where politics always rocks.
Libertarian Party is America's third largest and fastest growing political party. Libertarians engage in a variety of projects working for everyone's liberty on every issue. They were created in December of 1971 by people who realized that the politicians had strayed from America's original libertarian foundation with disastrous results. Their vision was the same as that of America's founders, a world where individuals are free to follow their own dreams in their own ways, a world of peace, harmony, opportunity, and abundance. They claim to be practical. In their own words, they say, "We know we can't make the world perfect, but it can be better." Libertarians will keep working to create a better, freer society for everyone. And as William Allen White once said, liberty is the only thing you cannot have unless you are willing to give it to others. Joining me today is Arvin Vohra from the U.S. House 5 in Maryland. He is running for Senate. He is an educator and entrepreneur who was born and raised in Maryland. His latest book is Lies, Damned Lies, and College Admissions. His company include Arvin Vohra Education, Mind Sculptor Software, and EducatorForSale.com. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, in your own words, why don't you tell our listeners exactly what the Libertarian Party is seeking to do in this election? And I'd also like to address why the media has given it such little coverage. A lot of people really just don't know who the candidates are. So introduce us to it and give us a little bit of insight into what we're missing.
Well, the Libertarian Party is defined primarily by its goals. And our goals are to cut government and advance liberty. At the federal level, that means eliminating some of the departments that just do more harm than good. Things like the Department of Education or the FDA or the Department of Agriculture. At the state level, it means doing the same and also repealing a lot of these regulations that get in the way of businesses, get in the way of jobs, get in the way of entrepreneurship. What it comes down to is allowing individuals to have more freedom and more prosperity by downsizing and reducing the size and the scope and the power of government.
With all of the gigantic ism that's going on with mega corporations in the world, and we have really become more of a corporation than we are a country, and we act like a corporation. So in the argument of taking away regulations and would it then allow these kinds of corporations and people that are really empowered to take over and do whatever they want and not have any respect for the environment and so on and so forth? What do you say to people who have concerns along those lines?
One of the most interesting examples of how that actually plays out involves Nike and New Balance, the shoe companies. Nike pushed hard for stricter environmental regulations on manufacturing, which came as a surprise to everyone because, why would they push for stricter regulations on themselves? As it turned out, Nike actually makes its shoes overseas, so it knew it was just using its power and influence over regulation to target its competitor, New Balance, that made its shoes in America. The problem with regulation is that the largest corporations are the ones that have the biggest influence on the regulations. So most of the regulations actually keep out small businesses. They prevent startups. They prevent small mom-and-pop shops. They prevent food trucks. You get rid of those regulations, that's more entrepreneurship, more opportunities for young people to start businesses, more opportunities for really anyone who doesn't have their own dedicated legal and regulatory department to be able to compete on an equal playing field with the largest corporations.
So we're looking at mom and pop shops versus like the Walmart conglomerate, and people are very, stressed out, and they say that there's rumors of the middle class, facts that the middle class are disappearing. You have people really worried about putting food on their table and feeding their families and just living a fair, honest life. How does the Libertarian Party offer something different than, say, the Republican or Democratic Party?
What it comes down to, really, at the end of this, is jobs. And with libertarian policies, you're going to have more jobs and you're going to also have more pathways to get a job. One of the most damaging policies that we're seeing from big government, and one of the things that the Libertarian Party is fighting against, is minimum wage laws. Because we realize that if you lower the minimum wage, you allow people who maybe don't have as big a degree, who maybe are younger, maybe had some difficulties in life and are trying to get their life back together, it makes it easier for people who haven't gone the expensive college route to get a job, to prove that they can be timely, to show their work ethic. And by getting rid of those things, you increase the opportunities there for everybody. But that's not the only type of opportunity that we're increasing. By getting rid of trade sanctions, we're allowing small businesses, or we want to allow small businesses to be able to trade freely with businesses in other countries the way that large businesses already do. Whenever you look at the way the trade sanctions work nowadays, there's always exceptions for all the big companies and no exceptions for small companies. And what our policies do is they get rid of the hurdles and the difficulties of doing that. Another great example, healthcare. The Libertarian Party realizes that you don't need to have expensive government-mandated healthcare as a prerequisite for employment. Because when you make it that much more expensive to hire somebody, you're just going to reduce the number and the quality of jobs. Instead, we say, get rid of all these mandates and requirements. Let employers hire people. Let there be more jobs. And when it comes to prosperity, jobs and businesses are what make that happen.
It's interesting when you're talking, it sounds great, but, and everybody offers some beautiful vision of what they think the United States could become. But when it comes down to putting these things into place and actualizing the vision and manifesting it into a local level, your party talks about breaking down the government role at a local level. How would that affect people who depend on government for living, such as welfare or Section 8? What kind of effect does your party's principles have on something like that?
It's important to understand that welfare is nobody's first choice. Nobody wants that to be their long-term only option. But the problem is that government has created something that's so tempting, especially to stay on, and so difficult to get off of. Right now, if you're on welfare and you're getting $20,000 a year doing that, versus getting a job to get paid $21,000 a year, it's basically saying you can work an extra 40 hours for $1,000 a year. And see, that's not really attractive. It's removing the natural incentive from the marketplace. What we believe is that individuals are much more capable of determining the difference between those who are in serious and deep need versus those who are just had their incentive and their initiative sapped by bad government programs. When it comes to welfare, we believe that charity can do so much more. And we know that the government realizes that as well. That's why they keep blockading charity. Whether it's New York City, that's banning, Jewish grandmothers from donating bagels to the homeless, or Las Vegas, that's preventing casinos from giving food to the homeless, or so many other states that blockade food donations to the homeless. Hunters for the Homeless donated 16,000 pounds of deer meat, dressed and ready, that was destroyed by the state. You see, they realize that it's a very emotional story for so many people to see people hungry. So they make it impossible, or they try to make it more difficult for the private sector, private charities, and private individuals to help. The Libertarian Party knows that what we need to do is turn that around and make it easier for people to participate in charities. One of the biggest and most important types of charity is medical charity. Right now, if you're a doctor and you want to provide free health care, you have to go abroad for Doctors Without Borders because you can't do that within the borders. The restrictions are so great. And so our biggest focus when it comes to things like welfare is to first get rid of all the restrictions that prevent charity. Second, really to focus on corporate welfare first. And then finally, let only charity deal with the remaining small amount of individual welfare, or charity, that will be necessary.
Thank you for that. Now, I know a lot of my listeners have a concern about the food industry in this country and the big controversy that swirls around GMO labeling. I recently interviewed someone in that department, and we had a great show and a great conversation about it. And we had some questions from listeners who asked, why aren't the candidates, the ones that we see on TV or really where it's all playing out, talk about these other issues that people really want to know about? They seem to avoid it and stick to all the regular issues. The food industry, the labeling, the GMOs, how does the Libertarian Party view the consumers' want for labeling in this dynamic topic that, we have to remember that GMOs are banned in 64 countries, but yet we seem to allow them to come into the United States and be born here. And we have kind of a dilemma with this. How do you see it personally and as the party representative? If the candidates were willing to talk about this, what's the general tone or theme through your party?
It's such an interesting issue because there's so many parts of it that are, I think, absolutely essential to any serious discussion of liberty. When we're talking about GMOs, we have to start by recognizing this fact. Every single corn subsidy is by definition a Monsanto subsidy. Monsanto, who's the most notorious bad actor in the area of GMOs, also is responsible for about 80% of corn production, 90% of soybean production. Those subsidies are GMO subsidies. Those subsidies are Monsanto subsidies. So the first step that we say is get rid of all those subsidies. Get rid of that just blatant crony capitalism where taxpayers are forced to support a specific company or a group of companies that they find morally repugnant. And as someone just speaking now, not on behalf of the party, but just as on behalf of myself, I am absolutely appalled that I have to pay money to support a company whose actions I fundamentally disagree with. I don't think that GMOs are the right thing to be doing at all. But there's a second part of it, which is you can't have liberty and laziness at the same time, which means that if you want food labeling, you have to tell the store that you shop at you want food labeling. And the great thing is so many food stores have actually started doing that. There's so many private organizations like the Non-GMO Project that let you know, they won't tell you that a food is genetically modified, but they'll tell you when a food is not genetically modified. So you can use that as a great reliable source. That's one of the reasons that we've strongly pushed for getting rid of the Department of Agriculture, because the Department of Agriculture is just as corrupt as the rest of the government and doesn't always, or as far as really ever, require that kind of labeling. A private company, however, can simply say, listen, if you want to sell your food here, you have to label it, and if you don't, you can't sell it here. And that's the kind of private sector solutions that really work, have been working, and I believe will continue to work once we get, and will work better once we stop subsidizing the enemy.
A lot of people say that Monsanto is a kind of a venomous creature that's made its way into the establishment through lobbyists and different politicians and have, basically the whole system in their pocket. How do you see the current establishment change that we're facing coming up as far as this topic goes? I mean, why would voting for a libertarian candidate matter when it comes to this? Because most people have the perception that Monsanto has politics bought, done deal. There's really nothing we can do about it except raise our arms and protest and kind of get over that. And it doesn't really have an effect. So I guess my question is, would a libertarian establishment be, guarantee the public that we wouldn't have Monsanto in our lives anymore? Would it change the dynamic completely?
I think that when you look at the fundamental nature of the Libertarian Party's goal, which is to dramatically reduce the size and the scope and the power of government, you realize that it's something that can't be bought as easily. The main reason, we're trying to shrink government so much that there's nothing to buy. We want government to be so small that there'd be no special favors to be bought. There'd be no reason to spend money on lobbying because we'd have nothing to sell. And see, that's the key difference. Monsanto, you're right, has bought Republicans and they've bought Democrats. And someone says, well, maybe for a little extra they can also buy Libertarians. The difference is Libertarians don't have anything to sell because we're trying to shrink government to the point that there are no special favors to be bought.
Something to think about. Now, we just saw a couple changes in the race this week. We saw some campaigns close down. The Cruz Kasich campaign closed down. Hillary and Trump seem to be gearing up to go head-to-head. What do you say to people who say, well, the Libertarian Party, I never see them in the media. CNN is never really talking about them. Why do you think that is? Is the media being unfair, or is it a matter of big money being able to buy airtime?
I think to a certain extent, the status quo media supports the status quo. The media that depends on the kind of special favoritism that they get from the FCC is going to support the establishment that creates that kind of special favoritism. But what we're also seeing is two things. First, on social media, where there's nothing to be bought besides each individual person's opinion, the Libertarian Party is exploding. It's one of the things that's been driving our increase in registrations all across the country. We're also seeing that is driving traditional media, forcing them to cover the Libertarian Party more. Why? Because if enough people ask their newspaper, hey, I was wondering, are you guys going to cover the Libertarian campaign? I'm kind of curious about it. The newspaper has to respond to its customers. It's not going to sell advertising if no one's going to buy or read the newspaper. I believe that the same is going to be happening soon in even larger media. In 2012, when Gary Johnson ran, he was on so many major shows, the Daily Shows, all over different news shows, talk shows. That happens because our message is strong. Does the media treat us fairly? Absolutely not. But it's becoming more fair, and I believe as more people demand libertarian solutions, it's going to continue to become even more fair. And even if it's never perfectly fair, it's going to get a lot better as more people seek what we're offering.
I also want to touch base on, you have a very long, wonderful background working in education. You have done a lot of work in the area. Do you feel that the education system that we have set up now as is going to cut it? I mean, Bernie Sanders talked a lot about reforming college and making it free and available to everybody, like it is in Europe in some cases. And you talk a little bit about on your website about how the education process is being kind of customized to people with challenges or, different ways of learning and being able to be successful with teaching more cognitive abilities and how people can enhance or increase their understanding of mathematics and that area. So you're kind of customizing an educational package or path for people who maybe struggle with the current structure. Could that be said for the general theme of humanity right now in the United States? It's like we kind of have to create a different structure in our politics, our political system, and how we even move through how we vote for people. I mean, the whole election process and voting and registration process, I mean, there's been some problems with it, and the system seems to be struggling with the demand from the public to change. How do you see the correlation between the vision that you have had success in with your education reform and relating it to the voting reform, how we can make the voting process better?
I believe that people have two very fundamental rights. One is, I believe people have the right to knowledge, whether that's academic knowledge, whether it's the type of knowledge that we were provided to by the heroic actions of Edward Snowden about what the NSA is really doing. And I also believe that people have the right to express their conscience. And one of those ways in which we do it in this society is we have the right to vote the way our consciences tell us to vote. If you're a Democrat, I believe you have the right to vote for Democrats. If you believe in the ideas of Republicans, you have the right to vote for Republicans. And I believe that if you're a Libertarian, you have the right to vote for Libertarians. That's what the ability to express your conscience involves. Now, the facts are that across the country, both Democrats and Republicans are engaging in the real voter suppression, the kind the media doesn't talk about. And what that means is they use all kinds of changes in laws, legal challenges, whatever they can, to try to keep the Libertarian Party off the ballot. Now, the reason they do is obvious. They don't want somebody to come in and take away the special favors of their employers. But the ways they do it are just so corrupt. To use an example from my home state in Maryland, to just get on the ballot in Maryland, we have to collect 10,000 signatures. But we actually have to collect a bunch extra because they invalidate a lot of signatures. They recently passed a new law that said that if a person, when they print their name, they leave out their middle initial, but they have their middle initial written on their voter registration card, wherever they left that, then that signature is automatically invalidated, and they can't re-sign a different petition for another 2 years. That's just blatant fear on the part of the Democratic and Republican parties, who don't want people to be able to vote for what they actually want. They want to force people not into the one-size-fits-all of education, but into the supposedly two very similar sizes-fit-all of Democratic and Republican politics. And just as we're working hard to allow more individualized education by getting rid of things like truancy laws, by getting rid of homeschool restrictions, by allowing people to choose whatever education they want, we're also trying to make sure that people have real meaningful choice in politics by making sure that libertarian voters can vote for libertarian candidates.
Well, it certainly makes me think. Now, on the subject of data mining, you mentioned Edward Snowden and the NSA. Last week I spoke to Chad Marlowe, a counsel for the ACLU, and we had a great show on this very topic. And when I asked him the question about how each, potential administration change would affect the laws that many of us are kind of, ignorant to, and how our privacy would be affected, he was he went into great depth in this topic. It was a fantastic, very informative show. I'm curious how the Libertarian Party views data mining by large corporations and government, and how an administration under your party would change that.
Let's take a look at the two different parts. If you voluntarily sign up on, for example, something like Facebook, and you give Facebook information, and then they use that money they sell that to advertisers, and it's declared in their terms of use, to me, while a person may not like that, that's a fair and honest agreement that you and Facebook have made, and you always have the option of not doing that. But when it comes to the government, things get very, very different. The idea that simply by living here, we no longer have the rights that we explicitly do have, as stated in the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, is absolutely preposterous. Under a libertarian administration, we're going to see quite a few things. First, we're going to see an absolute repeal of the Patriot Act, which is what enables this type of warrantless wiretapping in the first place. Second, we're going to see these type of mass surveillance programs entirely defunded. That means they just won't have the money to do them in the first place. And finally, we've seen so many libertarian candidates sign pledges that say that if they're elected, they're going to take the multiple, somewhere, but depending on how you count it, between 16 and 19 redundant spy agencies, massively compress them down, massively downsize them to one very small, constitutionally limited intelligence agency that engages in the kind of foreign military intelligence that makes sense, not the mass domestic surveillance that does nothing but infringe on privacy. It's really telling how ludicrous this policy is when you realize that for every one time the Patriot Act has been used for something even tangentially related to possibly being related to terrorism, it's been used 100 times for some victimless crime like drugs or prostitution or something else. We're giving up our fundamental rights, being forced to give up our fundamental rights for the most minor crimes possible. Under a libertarian administration, you will see that change.
Now, when it comes to foreign policy, a lot of these technological advances, as some put them, they're in place because they're, quote, fighting terrorism, or they're keeping the American people safe. When you look at the foreign policy of our current establishment and the potential coming establishments of the Republican and Democratic Party, they've been pretty clear in their foreign policy and where they stand. How does the Libertarian Party differ?
The current foreign policy is trying to fight ideas with explosive force. And to me, that's about as smart as trying to read a book by smashing it with a rock. The way to really spread the ideas that are going to transform, these dangerous states, whether it's North Korea, Iran, whether it's Syria, whichever countries The way to actually change the ideas in those places is what's already worked in China. Because guess what? China, the communist stronghold, has already basically become capitalist. It's adopted so many American ideas, and the reason is very simple. If you want to do trade with a country, if you want to sell products to a country, you have to understand your customers. You have to understand their mindset. And that means your copywriters have to understand American culture. Your graphic designers have to understand American cultures. Your product designers have to understand American culture. And by understanding that culture, you can't forget that as soon as you go home. You learn, you understand what this other way of thinking is. You don't forget that when you leave. When you have that free exchange of products and services along with those products, you get that exchange of ideas. And the great thing about the ideas that the American people have, not the American government, the American people, are that these are ideas that are just better. The ideas of being able to speak your conscience is just better. The idea of being able to have a fulfilling life is just better. The idea of living in a way that's uplifting or in a way with dignity is just better than the harsh, brutal utilitarianism of communist or theocratic regimes. And I believe that by getting rid of all these sanctions, by pulling our troops out of all these foreign military bases, by shutting down these heinous and horrific areas like Guantanamo Bay, by stopping these just massive drone attacks that just create more and more enemies, by ending that and replacing it with free trade, we're going to be fighting bad ideas with good ideas. And that's going to work much better than fighting bad ideas with weapons will ever work.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Now, people might be asking where they can find out more information about the candidates running under the Libertarian Party. Where would you tell them to go to find out more information?
To learn more about the Libertarian Party, just go to lp.org, and you can find out how to get involved. You can register to vote Libertarian. You can get involved in the campaign. In fact, you might even decide to run for office and make one of the biggest contributions you can to the cause of liberty. But there's so much great information right there at lp.org.
Wonderful. Arvin Vohra joined me, gave us some great information. The National Libertarian Party representative, thank you so much for being here and for giving us your time. We appreciate it.
And thanks so much for having me on.
You've just been rocked by Rockin' Politics.